Well, I am Joanna Sinwell. I'm the secretary of our NAMI Johnson County affiliate. And NAMI, if you don't know, stands for the National Alliance for Mental Illness. And we have every month a lunch and learn. And this month we are very proud to have with us Kahle and Talia Meidlinger. They're going to speak to us about adverse childhood experiences. Amy is the Intervention Programs Director at United for Youth. She comes from the Iowa City School District, where she worked as a student and family advocate, focusing on supporting students with mental health concerns. She is trained in dialectic behavioral therapy and critical incident stress management. She has a master's degree in student development in post-secondary education from the University of Iowa. And Talia is a licensed independent social worker and the executive director at United Action for Youth, a nonprofit based in Iowa City. She's built her career working with at-risk youth and building trusting relationships with community providers to improve outcomes for youth who are most vulnerable. She emphasizes the importance of knowledge about trauma, brain development, and adolescence as the best avenue for achieving positive outcomes in working with all young people. So welcome to our presenters, and I'll let you take over.
Thanks for that awesome introduction. It's great to see everybody here. Again, I'm Talia Meidlinger, pronouns are she, her, executive director here at UAY.
And I'm Amy Kahle, she, her pronouns, intervention program director.
Okay, so we will get rolling. Let me share my screen here real quick. Okay. All right, so as they sort of said, we'll be talking about adverse childhood experiences, just sort of going over a refresher about what that means. But I think what's most important for us to understand is how those adverse childhood experiences impact brain development, the way young people and adults as well show up in spaces, and how to make sense of this, how to have this as sort of a framework for how we think about interacting with folks, because we don't always know what people have experienced minutes before, days before, years before they're in front of us. So go. Sorry, hang on a second. There we go. There's us. So we're going to talk about, obviously, ACEs and going over that, but we're going to tie it into the teenage brain, and how we provide trauma-informed relationships and spaces for folks, just things for us to know about how trauma impacts brain development and the way people in front of us are showing up in spaces. So real quick.
Yeah, so I think that sometimes it's on us as adults to take the lead in doing exactly what you're doing today and learning about ACEs and trauma, but also taking the lead when we're showing up with youth or adults that are in crisis on kind of calming our own bodies and modeling behavior for others that will help them manage their own emotions. So one thing that we talk a lot about at UAY, and what I talk a lot about to people in the community, is mindfulness and breath work. We take about 22,000 breaths a day, and we don't think about that very often. So just taking some time to notice what an important job it is for our body to keep all of that oxygen going through, and using our lungs to kind of calm the body. So we're going to start out today with a little breathing. We're going to talk about why that's important and what it does in your organs of your body a little bit later. But right now we're just going to start out our lunch and learn with some breathing. So this is what I want you to do. If you're comfortable, I'd like you to close your eyes. If you're not comfortable with that, keep your eyes open, but kind of keep your gaze down and unfocused. We're going to take 5 breaths together. Here's what I would like you to pay attention to when you're breathing. I want you to make sure that your inhale takes less time than your exhale. So maybe you'll inhale for 4 counts, you'll hold for 2, and then I want you to exhale for 6 counts. And we'll talk about why that's important later. But I'll count us through the first part, and then I'm going to let you breathe your last breaths on your own so that everybody's lung capacity is different. So go ahead and take an inhale for 4, 3, 2, 1, hold for 2, 1, and then we're going to exhale for 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Go ahead and repeat that cycle 2 or 3 more times. Noticing when the breath enters your body and what that feels like. Noticing how it feels to exhale that breath through your nose or through your mouth. Might feel warm. Notice how your body's responding to that exhale of breath. And then when you're done, slowly open your eyes and maybe just throw in the chat how you're feeling right now.
We're going to monitor this because it's our favorite part is to engage. So if you guys can throw in the chat some things that you notice that feel different after just taking some intentional breaths. More focused. Mm-hmm. Yep. Good to be mindful and
in the moment, calm, slower.
Mm-hmm.
If anybody noticed like the urge to yawn, or you feel a little sleepy now, that's good. That means you're doing it right. And we'll talk a little bit about that later, why that is in your body a little bit later. But yes, so if we can model this, just the simple thing is monitoring your breath to people that might be escalated for a variety of reasons, not just because they have ACEs in their background, but for a variety of reasons that can just it can de-escalate a situation just by using your breath.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thanks for playing along with me.
Okay, I almost forgot where we were going because I'm feeling a little calmer. So yeah, remember to breathe heading into difficult conversations. Many conversations with young people can be difficult, right? They are wired to push back. And if we're not in our grounded best selves, we're not going to show up as the adults that we want to be. And so think of everything that we're talking about today as a framework, as a way to reconsider how you move about your day-to-day life, interactions, relationships. And also we prefer this be interactive. So if we say something that hits and you want to hear more or ask a question, throw it in the chat. Or if you're like, oh, aha, that really hit for me. We love it. We're awesome. And we get to spend most of our days together. So if you want to join in and be a part of it, we would love to be a little more interactive with you all. So Amy's laughing because I am hilarious. All right. Moving on. So let's talk about the teenage brain. Were you gonna?
I was gonna hop in, but
yeah,
that's all right.
hop in. Go ahead.
So the average teenage brain is just on fire with activity, right? So it's been growing all of these different pieces throughout the life. And then teenage time is the time where it kind of prunes back. It decides what it's going to keep and what it's going to prune back. So there's so many rapid fire connections happening in the brain. Myelin sheaths are being developed so that communication is more straightforward and structured. All of this is going to eventually make the brain more effective. But during those teenage years, we know that the brain is not always effective, right?
And so this is kind of a bullet list, right? And I'm sure if any of you have known or could remember once when you were a teenager, that all of these things, yeah, act on impulse. Like, why did you do that? I don't know. I just thought I wanted to see what happened, and I didn't think about what comes next, right? Misread or misinterpret social cues and emotions. Like the number of times that I'm like, how do I look angry right now? I feel angry right now. And they're like, I didn't even read that, right? Like, I didn't know that I was pushing your buttons, because teenagers, their brains are so busy. They're not always reading those physical social cues.
The opposite of that is when you ask a teenager to do something, they're like, why do you hate me? Like, I don't hate you. I'm not showing you that at all. I'm just asking you to clean your room, Jack. May or may not be my son's name. So yeah.
There's also a natural decrease in the production of those positive feel-good chemicals in teenage brains. That's why they're more likely to participate in dangerous or risky behavior, right? Because those things give us a dopamine drop, which feels good, or they get really lovey, really invested in their friendships, right? And peer connections, but also romantic relationships. They're less likely to think before they act, pause to consider the consequences, or change the dangerous or inappropriate behaviors, right? And so sometimes you ask a kid, why did you do that? And they're like, I don't know. And then as adults, we get irritated because we're like, well, now you're lying to me. Of course you know why you made that decision. But teenagers oftentimes really don't know. I don't know. I saw a button and it said, don't push it, but I just wanted to see what would happen if I pushed it. I, as an adult, know, it probably says don't push it because something really bad could happen on the other side of that. I just will resist the urge. Teenagers lack that impulse control. So all of this, right? Explanations, not excuses, buys us a little bit of sanity when we're in front of a young person who's really frustrating us, right? Who it doesn't make sense what their behavior is.
So I'll also add there that just how the brain develops, it develops from front to back. The prefrontal cortex is in the very front here, and that's kind of our reasoning. That's if I do this, then that, pros and cons, logic. That develops last. So in a typical human being, that's not gonna be fully developed until about 25. If you have trauma, if you have significant trauma or a lot of ACE scores, that is delayed even more. So I think that that's important given our discussion. And then also the other thing to think about is there's a little teeny almond shaped piece of your brain tucked way back in the middle that's called the amygdala. That is the fight or flight. That's kind of the ancient mammalian part of your brain that is impulse. And when you're a teenager, that's what's doing the driving. The prefrontal cortex is there, but the amygdala just takes the lead. And sometimes it takes a little mindfulness, a couple deep breaths for the prefrontal cortex to catch up to the amygdala.
So there's a little bit about brain development, right? Important to understand as we go through this, like Amy just touched on. Complex trauma actually changes the size of your brain, of parts of your brain, right? Makes your amygdala bigger and more active and makes your prefrontal cortex develop more slowly and sometimes even can be smaller. So, right, so making sense of behaviors is important. We've talked about that, skipped that slide a little bit, but that was just our little cue to talk about brain development stuff. Okay, so now I'm going to do a brief overview of ACEs and we'll just kind of ping pong back and forth here. But one thing that I think is really interesting about the ACEs study is before they decided to study adverse childhood experiences, this actually started out as a attempt to help folks who were clinically obese lose weight. And a lot of people dropped out of the trial and it wasn't effective. And talking about obesity and that as the number one, negative health outcome for people is problematic. But what they did find is that a lot of people in these studies had major health concerns, and they also had a number of traumatic childhood experiences that launched them into understanding what are the long-term health impacts and outcomes of people who have experienced a lot of traumatic things in their lives. So they launched the ACEs studies. And so what they found is that the more traumatic things you experience in childhood, the more likely you are to have detrimental health outcomes as an adult. High blood pressure, heart problems, more likely to be a smoker, to abuse substances in some way, shape, or form, right? Which all have negative impacts for our well-being. And so when we talk about the three types of ACEs that were included in the study, we're talking about abuse, so physical, emotional, sexual, neglect, physical and emotional, and the household dysfunction. Maybe there was mental illness, maybe a parent was incarcerated, maybe there was abuse from one parent to the other, substance abuse, divorce, right? These are the pretty big, easy to identify. Well, of course, that would have a negative impact on you. Other things that are also included in the ACEs study now, and for us to think about in terms of what are traumatic experiences, think about anything that overwhelms your ability to cope, right? Maybe you live in a really, really rough neighborhood where gun violence is a regular part of your life, or you have a number of family members who have been incarcerated or have died of gun violence. Maybe you have a highly critical parent. Nothing is ever good enough for them, right? That can be traumatic, right? That can change the way people move through the world. And so we're talking about big T trauma here in ACEs, but understanding that there's a lot of underlying smaller T traumas that feel more like pinpricks than like major experiences that also impact how people feel in the world and how people move in the world. All of this to say that when you're interacting with people and what they're doing doesn't make sense to you, always consider and put at the forefront, I have no idea what this person has been through. I have no idea. Maybe they're triggering about something I've said or done. Maybe what I've done has reminded them of something traumatic they've experienced in the past, right? And so what they found is, right, again, to circle back, the higher your ACEs score is, the more likely you are to suffer from detrimental health diagnoses. So let's move on. Go ahead, you want to take this one?
All right, so a lot of us have ACEs in our background. And again, those 10 traumas that were in the ACEs study, those are the ones that were studied. But we know, especially in the past few years, we've had COVID, we've had racial discord, we've had an extreme distancing in our political views, right? We have all kinds of trauma that wasn't necessarily studied in ACEs. But of these 10 things that were studied, about 61% of the adults reported at least having one of the ACEs, and 1 in 6 had more than four or more. And Talia mentioned this earlier, but it has negative health impacts. We have a slide that's coming up next that shows that a little bit more. But obesity, heart disease, because you have a higher ACEs score, you may engage in some more risky behaviors. And then so that might increase your chance of having a sexually transmitted infection. Cancer is higher if the higher you go in your ACEs score. You have an increased risk for trafficking. We presented a very similar presentation to the sex trafficking investigators unit over the summer, and there were a lot of head nodding when we were talking about ACEs. A lot of their clients that they saw had high ACE scores. Oftentimes there's a big gap in employment or education, because that takes a certain kind of organization and mental state, and a lot of people can't maintain that. And then they also found that people with high ACE scores sometimes will transfer that to their children. So maybe you are living in generational poverty, or you have a lot of joblessness in your family, or there's historical racism that's been generational for your family. And so that makes a huge difference in the ACE scores as well.
So here's this is from the ACEs 360 Iowa website, but we're looking here at generational embodiment, historical trauma, right? So conception all the way to death, kind of looking at all of the impacts that ACEs can have on folks, and understanding that it's not just, well, you had a tough upbringing and I'm sure you'll overcome that. It can change and alter the trajectory of our well-being for our entire lives, right? And so we're looking at social conditions and local context. Where do you live? What's happening in your community, in your home? How are you parented? How are you getting along in your home? And then the disrupted neurodevelopment we talked about, right? Complex trauma can stunt people's brain growth, right? Because if you're trying to survive all the time, your brain isn't functioning the way it needs to. Disease, disability, and social problems, and then for some, early death.
Well, we live in a society that's a pick yourself up by the bootstraps, right? We like to think that everybody has the same amount of opportunity, but that generational embodiment, that historical trauma really puts many people in kind of a negative starting place. So we don't all have the same starting place. I think they just added that piece of this triangle this year, and I'm really happy about that.
Yeah. So one thing, right, that is important to talk about when we talk about ACEs are neural networks, right? Talking about that brain development and how does this really impact you? So we like to think about, down here we have all the risk factors just to kind of keep that in the back of your mind. But if you have an adaptive neural network, you've got your basic needs met, you have supportive adults, you have a pretty good sense of self, you know how you fit into the world, you can set boundaries to keep yourself safe, right? You know how the world is going to treat you because you've been treated pretty well by the world, right? By your caretakers. And then the other side is if you have a maladaptive neural network, right? Your basic, whoops, didn't mean to do that. Your basic needs maybe weren't met, or it was shaky, unsure. You had absent or critical parents, substance abuse, all of those things. You have a shaky sense of self, right? Maybe you're more likely to be pushed into peer pressure. You don't have a great sense of setting boundaries or sense of self, prone to manipulation, those sorts of things. The positive thing about this, though, right, is through positive relationships and therapy and awareness and education about this stuff and supportive environments, positive experiences can reshape a maladaptive neural network into an adaptive neural network, right? So the kid who once was really defensive, if you asked him to put his pencil down because he had a really high ACEs score and felt really, really bad about himself, through positive connection and relationships and therapy and intervention, that young person develops a different sense of self and improves health outcomes in the future, right? Those interventions, those positive environments are key for rebuilding those neural networks. And so that's why we talk about, right, hearing all this stuff can be like, oh my God, we're doomed. How do we fix this? How do we get past this? And the truth is, through personal relationships, trust, and understanding this to shape the way that we interact with folks who have a high ACEs score, who are generally prickly people, hard to engage with, hard to interact with, push our buttons, right? Because they have to keep themselves safe. You want to take this one?
Mm-hmm. So this is just kind of another graphic to show what Talia was just talking about. So if you have a high ACEs score, when you survive the world, when you move through the world, you're thinking that there's danger all around you. Your amygdala is on fire. It's got to be ready for anything that might be harmful to you. And sometimes, even when you are in a place where you are 100% safe, your amygdala is still on fire. It's still looking out. So you're constantly looking through the world in a lens that might be danger, right? If you have adaptive neural networks, if you have a low ACEs score or no ACEs, then you feel pretty safe. You move through the world safely. And that informs how we go through the world. That informs what our relationships look like. That informs how we might interact with a stranger on the street. If I feel like the world's a pretty safe place, I might say, hey, and wave to somebody, right? If I think that the world is always is a dangerous place, I might not want to interact with anyone. I saw this a lot at City High. If I was roaming the halls after the bell rang, and I would ask a student, hey, what are you doing? Why aren't you in class? Somebody that is kind of growing up with the safety, which people are okay. There's a full of possibility. I'm going to process things with people might say, oh, I'm just having a really hard time. I need to talk to someone. Or I just ran to the bathroom and I'm late for class. I'm on my way. Somebody that's kind of always thinking that people are out to get them and moving through the world and with a lens of danger might yell at me. Who the hell are you to tell me to get to class? They might have a few choice words for me and take off the other way. That's not on me. That's where they're coming from, how they're making their way through the world.
And remembering that trauma can impact all elements of children's development. It's not just, oh, you're sad all the time, right? Or you act out all the time. Things must be bad at home. It also impacts memory because it impacts the brain. When our amygdala is activated, it's hard for us to accurately retell an experience or to retell a memory or to even store that memory appropriately, right? And so sometimes kids who have a lot of trauma or a high ACEs score have a hard time learning information and saying, I'm having a hard time with my alphabet, or I can't remember how to read that word. Emotional regulation, maybe outbursts, or a hard time connecting with peers. Body control, right? Maybe they're really impulsive. A lot of distrust, hard to build relationships. Those kids that you're like, gosh, everything I try, I just can't get through to this young person. Well, their bodies have learned to survive, right, at worst case scenario. And so they're constantly in fight or flight mode. And so these things on this list that we would say, oh, these are kind of things that we check off to understand how a young person is doing, those are not a priority to them because it's all about survival.
Another thing that can happen is the person can actually have a weakened immune system. So it causes some inflammation and a weakened immune system. So, boy, that kid's sick all the time. Yeah, they are. And they're actually really sick because the trauma has affected their immune system. So this would be your typical development. I don't have to worry about survival. I have food. I have people who love me. I have a place to stay that I know is safe. Therefore, I can regulate myself. I can make those connections, and then I can learn, right? Somebody with a high ACEs score, that's completely flipped around. So look at the cognition part, the learning part. The person with a typical development can spend all of their energy, all their brain energy, on learning. A person with a high ACEs score who's hyper vigilant all the time and worried about danger and worried about survival, their cognition is tiny. So they're not going to spend near as much time during their day learning than they are just surviving.
Yeah, for any social workers, right? We talk about Maslow's hierarchy of need, and this is just another way that we're talking about that. If you don't have this basic need of survival and needs met, how are you going to be worried about how you perform on a spelling test when you just need to stay alive when you get at home? That's a little bit hyperbolic, but it's true that if you're worried all the time and in survival mode all the time, there's no way that you can get up to that purple cognition.
And if we've been in trauma or been in a situation where we have felt unsafe for a long time, even when we are in safety, our brain doesn't know that. Our brain, those neural networks that we talked about, all of those synapses that are getting formed, they're saying danger, danger, danger. So even if the danger has passed, even if when I was a child, I was in a different situation and I was in danger, but now I'm a high school student and I'm like, your family has gotten some support. You're in a really good place now. You should be okay. That their brain doesn't necessarily know that those connections can be changed, but they can't be changed overnight. It takes a while.
Mm-hmm. And it can be frustrating if you're working with young. How many times, how patient do I have to be? How long is this going to take? It takes a while to unlearn patterns and behavior. It takes a while for your brain to kind of catch up with reality, which is, I'm safe. And so those are the kids that we really have to figure out, how do we apply this framework for? How do we have the space and grace and patience to help this young person continually feel safe in this environment so that they can turn things around? So in trauma-informed relationship building, and really this is in all relationships, right? We talk about this when we go to schools, we talk about this in families, we talk about this around here with our young people. In this order, young people want to be safe, physically, emotionally, and socially, right? That's just the baseline. We want to have our basic safety needs met. They want to be seen. Hi, love your haircut. That's a great new pair of shoes. I really missed you that you weren't here last week, right? You're important. 3, to be wanted. Hey, you have good ideas. Can you help me, right? I needed you to be here. I want you to be here. You're important to me. To be competent. You're really good at that, right? Noticing what people are good at and to contribute. I need your ideas. I need your input. How do we solve this problem? What is it that you need? Can we work together? And these things, like, you guys might be looking at the screen going, well, no, duh. And this is how you repair those maladaptive neural networks, right? To be intentional about your relationships. And under that safe part is acknowledging that just because someone's showing up in a way that doesn't make sense to you, doesn't mean it doesn't make sense to them, right? Mm-hmm. People generally only do things that make sense to them. And so to be inquisitive about it, which I'm going to skip ahead to my slide, but I'm going to ruin it. Okay. So we've got a few more minutes, which is perfect because we can have some questions, but these are the tools and frameworks, right? So we've kind of done the overview, but these are things for you all to take away with you to work with young people, but work with all people. First of all, it's not personal. It's adolescence. Let as much as you can fall on that brain development piece. We'll get there. Validation is magic. We'll go over that a little bit. Our breath is powerful, and think about your lens. So we'll hit those real quick. I'll take this one.
Oh, I was
the teenage brain. It's busy and easily overwhelmed and often overcomplicates things, right? So it's not personal. It's just adolescence. It's frustrating to our fully developed adult brains, but it's not intentional. Sometimes young people push our buttons. That's also a developmentally appropriate thing. But for us to just always lean on, okay, a lot of this is brain development stuff, and I'm going to use that to buy me some sanity in this moment.
All right. Validation. This is one of my favorite things in the world. When I, in my bio, it said that I'm trained in dialectic behavioral therapy, and a big part of that is validation. And it was game changing for me as a practitioner, and it was game changing for me as a parent, and frankly, as a wife. It was game changing for me. So validation, I'm going to start with what it is not. It's not condoning bad behavior. It's not agreeing with negative things. It's not letting someone off the hook just so that you can protect their emotions. And it's not, most importantly, it's not problem solving. So for instance, my son gets mad at me because I have asked him to bring his clothes down so that they can be washed, and he's in the middle of his Xbox Madden playoff game. May or may not have happened this week.
It happened.
So he's angry at me. Instead of saying, I don't give a crap about that game. I need to do laundry. I have to work tomorrow. You don't have any clean pants. I said, I know that's really hard. I understand that you're in the middle of the game, and I understand that it's a playoff game, a virtual playoff game, and that might be really hard. Can you hit pause for a second, grab those clothes, and then get back to it? So I don't agree that him playing his video game is more important than anything that I have going on, or that it's important at all, to tell you the truth. But I know that for him it is. And just me validating that, I know, but it won't take you very long. I know this is really hard, but do it for me really quick. That immediately took it from an escalated situation where we were both yelling at each other, trying to prove our points, to him saying, oh, she does understand that this is important for me and that other thing's important for her. So I'm going to do this. It's not problem solving. It's not me saying, hey, Jack, I'll just grab those clothes for you. Right. It's not if I'm frustrated with Talia for something and she just jumps in and tries to solve it, it's her letting me know that my emotions are valid, right? So validation it truly is magic. I believe that. It's identifying and affirming emotions. That must have made you really sad. You must have been really angry to hit that kid in the hallway, right? Do I agree that he should have hit the kid in the hallway? Absolutely not. But man, if you did it and you were willing to get in trouble and probably have an out of school suspension, you must have been really mad. It calms the amygdala. So that, remember, we're on emotion. We're running on emotion. We're running on impulse. Validation calms it. Validation stops you in your tracks and says, oh, I was ready to fight you, but you do get me. Right? You don't agree, but you get me. And then it instantly builds rapport with people. She's not shutting me down. She's saying that she understands how I feel. It's amazing.
And, just another personal example, right? It leads to problem solving. The other day, my 6-year-old wailed on my 3-year-old, hit him super hard. He was crying, she was screaming. And I went in and he said, she hit me. And I said, you must have been really mad, so mad to hit your brother. I was really mad. And right. And then she started to share with me why she was so mad. And I said, gosh, that's really frustrating. And I bet you also don't like that you hit your brother. No. Right. And then came problem solving. What might we do different next time? Right. Because I understood I don't want my kids to hit each other. And I know that they don't hit each other unless there's some big emotion underneath that.
And remember, let's bring it back to ACEs for a second. Children, teens, adults with a lot of trauma frequently haven't had their feelings acknowledged or validated. So you're okay. It's okay. Don't feel that way. Don't cry. Don't tell anybody, right? All of those things that we were told when we were kids. So, or they're frightened when they do have emotions. So they're hiding them. They don't trust their emotions. Boy, I was mad and then something happened to me and that didn't work. So I'm not going to trust my own emotions. So then they kind of develop these distorted relationships. So validating, I think that's the first step in kind of repairing some of those relationships and those neural networks.
Absolutely.
All right. And breath is important. So we did a little bit of breathing at the beginning. The breath is so important. And this is a picture of my favorite nerve of the body. We'll go through afterwards and everybody can tell me their favorite nerves.
You're on my last one.
Mine is the vagus nerve. It's the longest nerve in the body, and it's a cranial nerve that goes down, and it impacts it's kind of your rest and digest. So it impacts your heart rate, it impacts your blood pressure, it impacts your memory, and it helps with relaxation. So any way that we can activate the vagus nerve, it's a body hack. It will force us to calm down. So when we did that breathing exercises and you said you felt calm, that's because you activated your vagus nerve, right? Taking slow, deep breaths where your exhale is longer than your inhale forces your body to calm down even when you don't want to. Other things that do it, cold shower. When my son is super, super escalated, especially in the winter, we go out for a walk without a coat, because it activates your vagus nerve and he is almost instantly calmer. Humming and gargling. If it's hard to sing when you're really, really activated, but if you can hum or you can gargle, that activates your vagus nerve. And then there's guided meditations. There's a whole bunch of stuff, but this is something that we all have in our bodies that we can hack almost instantly. So we need to tap into it.
Yeah, that whole take a deep breath and count to 10. I am so mad. That is insane. It actually works, right?
Yeah. And maybe you don't say it, maybe you model it. Maybe you say, you know what, I'm feeling a little escalated right now. I'm going to take a deep breath. And 9 times out of 10, if I'm sitting in a room with a teenager who's activated and I start taking deep breaths, they co-breathe with me, whether they like it or not. It just happens.
Yep. So the last like sort of framework and thing for us to tell you like as a tool is thinking about what lenses do you see the world through? If the behavior doesn't make sense to you, resist the urge to label it as wrong and notice, right? This doesn't make sense to me. I don't know everything about this person's thought process. Be curious, right? My experience of the world as a cis, white, gay, married, Midwestern, middle class human, that's been my upbringing my whole life, impacts how the world interacts with me and how I interact with the world. And so what makes sense to me doesn't make sense to everybody else. And if we come at it with curiosity and some questioning and some calming, it opens up that door for relationship and further conversation and better understanding. I think we're often quick to say it's wrong when it just doesn't make sense or it's different. And so just being curious and using the stuff that we've talked about today to help inform that curiosity and there must be things that I don't understand that are happening for this person in front of me right now. And this applies for young people and adults and anyone that you interact with on the day-to-day, in your day-to-day life. So
I love this one because it ties back to validation. So because of your experience, you might say, well, for me, that would have, right? Back when I was in high school, I love my husband to death, but he does that a lot to my son. Well, when I was in high school, I had to do it this way or that way. That's super invalidating because you're taking in my case, my husband's experience growing up and placing it onto my son's feelings and emotions. And that's invalidating. So instead of that, you can be curious. So that really seems like you're upset. So what does that mean to you? What does that look? What made you upset? Be curious, ask questions instead of, in my day,
back when I was your age,
Yeah.
doesn't go over with the young folk. Trust us, we've tried. So, and that is all we have for you guys. So if you have questions or comments or anything you want to share, we're here for a little bit longer with y'all. Thank you,
Thank you.
guys. Not everybody all at once.
I just want to say, Talia, thank you. I have a 6 and a 3-year-old grandchildren that are spent a lot of time with, and that was a really helpful example.
I mean, it works for everyone, right? All of this stuff is transferable, whether there's trauma or not. All these skills are transferable and should shape the way that we interact with all of our people, right? Because it's hard to be a human.
I have a colleague that used to say, when we were talking about trauma-informed classrooms and trauma-informed care, that we shouldn't just be this way with people that have had trauma or high ACEs scores. It's similar. It should be a universal precaution. Because we don't know what other people have been through in their life. We may look at someone and see no trauma. That doesn't mean anything. There could be a ton of trauma underneath. And B, they're just good practices. Just like her example, which I loved, was that a doctor doesn't ask you if you have any bloodborne diseases when he puts gloves on when you go to the emergency room. He just puts gloves on, right? It's a universal precaution. So a lot of these things that we talk about with trauma-informed care and trauma-informed relationships should just be universal.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
All righty.
I do have a question.
Yeah.
So do you recommend people taking the ACEs test so they can be self-aware of where they're coming from? Is that something that is good to do with a management team? Is it something good to do with an entire agency? Obviously, I'm looking at the lens through the ambulance department.
Sure. I would, so if you were going to do something like that, you would want to scaffold it and have some support on hand, because ACEs isn't common knowledge for everyone. And when you have to answer the question, these are things that could, right, be a traumatic experience. Sometimes people get really overwhelmed and they're like, oh my gosh, this is really hard and painful. And I had no idea that this was a thing. But certainly I think it's a good way to get your staff to think about what is your stuff and what is the stuff, right? There's a lot of things that we experience that are normalized in our lives. And until someone shines a light on it and goes, that's not healthy or normal, we don't realize it. And so I think it's a good framework to have people learn about ACEs, but I would unless you have support on board to help people process whatever might come up
Mhm.
from them, I would hesitate to just say blanket, like, we're just going to make you all take this survey. But I
Yeah.
think it's a good awareness tool.
Yeah.
I've had some people that have had the divorce one, and that has really thrown them for the loop, because some people come from divorced families and it was good. It was a good thing. It was a positive thing. And they're like, oh my gosh, divorce is on mine. And so therefore I have all of this trauma.
Mhm.
So yeah, I agree.
Thank you.
If you just Google ACEs, like there's a whole ACEs 360 website and they have all the questions, everything is there. And so I would like for all of you on this call, go take a look and just look at those questions, but just be aware that if you haven't looked at it before, some of the things that the boxes you check might be like, oh, wow, I didn't realize that could be, and it might not be traumatic for you. It might not have been a traumatic experience, but for some people it is. And so to just be aware of stuff that comes up.
That ACEs 360 website's really good. They even have a couple like self-guided classes on, so you can get a little more in-depth about adverse childhood experiences.
I think more discussion about this has allowed us to talk more openly about resilience and what that magic recipe is. And, you know, I've known people with lots of ACEs who are incredibly resilient, and people with not so many ACEs or none who are not. And so you just wonder what that magic recipe is, don't you? It's hard to know.
Well, it's like an inborn grit. Some people, right? You're like, how are you making it through all these things? And other people, not so much. But I think, you know, it all boils down to also that support piece and how safe and belonging and where you accepted kind of
Right.
stuff.
Right. That one loving person, regardless of who it is, can make such a difference.
The CDC did a study, I'm not exactly sure how long ago it was, but they found that if you have one supportive adult in your life as a teenager, you are 66% less likely to engage in risky behaviors as an adult. So risky behaviors being, you know, drugs, sex, all of the things that, so, and I thought that was so important to think that carried on through adulthood. So even a teacher that I really had a connection with as a 7th or 8th grader can still be, that's a powerful thought too. I always mention that when I'm talking to teachers, because that is such a powerful tool that we have.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, often teachers are I tell my husband, he's a retired teacher, you might be the best thing they get all day.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
And yeah, there are people throughout our entire lives and days who look forward to that 1 hour or 20-minute time with us because we make them feel seen, heard, safe, all of those things.
Yeah, which speaks to why COVID was so disruptive to our, you know, emotions and our societal health, right?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Hi, Talia and Amy. This was a great presentation. There's quite a bit of research on ACEs and its impact on brain development, like you guys have touched on, but also on metabolic risk factors or cardiovascular risk factors. But I feel like as researchers, we're more on the side of looking at risk factors and negative outcomes, but there's very little about protective factors. So I'm curious about your experiences with what makes the brain development to try to go back to its normal trajectory, and how you implement these in your daily practice.
Yeah, this is one. So you hit a nerve a little bit. We talk about this a lot here at UAY because prevention is impossible to prove, right? It's hard to fund. It's not quantitative. You know, it's often qualitative, like this had a positive impact on my life, but how do you, put that into a research study and say, see, these preventative spaces are working? And it's not until 10, 20, 30 years down the road, the number of times we have a young person come back to UAY and say, this place changed my life. I only made it through middle school or high school. I didn't kill myself because I could come out, because I'm a successful adult, because I have self-love, because is infinite. All the time people are like, this place saved my life, but we don't know that, right? Maybe you came to the youth center or to some of our programs 20 times, 30 times, 40 times, 100 times, but we can't prove that that's going to have a positive outcome.
We can't have a control group.
But in terms of the research stuff, one of the things that I really appreciate was I was trained in EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, to deal with traumatic events. And one of the things, and that's where I got the language for the adaptive and maladaptive neural networks. One of the only things that can repair those networks is positive pro-social relationships that build self-esteem, feelings of self-worth, and feelings of ability to set boundaries and things like that. So in terms of rewiring that, it's really intentional effort and spaces to have a consistent sort of dissemination of positive experiences and boundary setting and stuff like that. So, you know, we talk about, wow, this kid at school is really disturbed, we need to get them into therapy. Sure. And then they're going right back to that home environment that is reinforcing those negative and maladaptive neural networks, right? And so if we're thinking about how do we actually make an impact on the brain development of anyone who has had a litany of traumatic experiences, it's an overhaul, right? We have to really intentionally, carefully set up ways for those folks to have the opportunity to rewire. And so it's really not just an individual, it's a system, it's a family system. It's really looking at all of the ways that basic needs need to be met in order for someone to move up that pyramid to self-actualization. So that's a very long answer. But it's, you know, positive relationships, positive environments, therapy, social supports, all of those things can help rewire that. Thanks, Fiona. Appreciate you too. Anything else?
This has been wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming, and we're always here. If you want to shoot us an email, if you have a
So
follow-up.
can you tell me, tell me a little bit more about United Action for Youth and where you are and
Sure. Yeah. We're located in Iowa City. We have a youth center downtown on Iowa Ave, and then we have our Eastdale location over here. We like to call ourselves a one-stop shop for all things youth and families. If we don't do it, we'll find somebody else who does and get a referral going. But we kind of talk about our things in terms of prevention and intervention. So downtown is our youth center. Young people can drop in, hang out. We have a recording studio, free art studio, free art lessons, free music lessons. And then over here, we have our intervention program. So that's homeless support for young people who are homeless. That's our transitional living program. Support for young people who are pregnant and or parenting. We have our crisis advocacy and mediation program to help young people navigate whatever comes their way, which is a lot. We have a formal therapy program. We have a sexual health educator who goes into the schools and provides evidence-based sexual health information. We have a Spark program, which is targeted at serving BIPOC youth and positive pro-social physical activities, helping them find their spark. They go out canoeing, kayaking, hiking, fishing, boxing, all with this lens of having really positive pro-social, social emotional conversations. Did I miss anything?
LGBTQ plus programming.
Yep. Support for parents. We actually do a shoplifters diversion program for young people who get picked up shoplifting. And we actually just got a new grant to provide more diversion opportunities for young people who make a bad decision and get caught up in some stuff. So,
And we do a lot of court advocacy so we'll be along with a youth if they have to go through court as a victim. So we'll head up that team.
that's great. So who are some of your primary funders? United Way, one of them, or?
We do have some United Way funding. We have a number of county grants, some federal grants. Something like 86% of our budget is all grants.
Wow.
Yeah.
We know about that.
Yeah.
I just want to say, I give you a huge shout out for your young parents program. I mean, if we're talking about ACEs, how do you help young people who may not have had any model of good parenting themselves start out on the right foot so they're not creating a traumatic environment for their own new children? And I know that you follow them up until the kid goes to kindergarten, I believe.
Yeah.
Isn't that your general?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I don't know that anywhere else in Iowa City is doing that. And that's wonderful. Wonderful.
Yeah.
So Neighborhood Centers of Johnson County has a parent advocacy program. They tend to be over the age of 21, 22, and we take the younger ones. So yeah. It's a great program. Any other questions?
I asked you a question about doing EMDR. Yeah, maybe a
Oh,
session.
I was just responding to, yeah, I was gonna say, I am not an expert. I did the training, and, use it in my therapy practice, but I could certainly connect you more. I could connect you with, the folks who did my training who are here.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you.
Would be great. Yeah. So,
Yeah, I think we're all very interested in learning more about that. Everyone, when I describe it to people, they look at me sort of like, that sounds kind of hocus pocusy, but it
no,
works.
I mean, it does sound hocus pocusy, and then you see it work, or I experienced it for myself and was like, oh,
Yeah, it's a different thing.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's fantastic.
Another thing that I would offer if you were interested is I'm trained in dialectic behavioral therapy, which the school district, the Iowa City School District is using right now in all of the
Awesome.
secondary schools. I'm doing a presentation actually tomorrow night for some educators across the state of Iowa, and I'd be more than happy to come in and do an overview of DBT if anybody's interested or.
Yes. Wonderful. Well, thank you.
Is that still kind of the first line for borderline personality disorder treatment?
Yeah, it is.
And
That's
this would be a good program, Joanna, because
Yeah.
that also would cross over into some of NAMI's clientele and so forth too. So
Yeah, that's what it was
There's so
developed.
many- Oh, go ahead.
That's what it was originally developed for, borderline personality and highly suicidal, chronically suicidal individuals. And then they learned that it did really great things with teenagers. And then Iowa City School District took it on, and they're teaching it as a standalone class that gets for credit. And I was the first teacher that taught that class. So it's really innovative, cool thing that the district is doing, and it's
Yeah, we
powerful.
talked about it in family to family because of its connection to borderline personality disorder. And, it was great because the teachers reminded everyone that there are people out there who say they're trained in DBT, but it really is a pretty rigorous process. And you want to make sure that you understand the series of
Yes, modules.
that the modules, right. So good. That's awesome. Thank
It
you.
looked like, it looked like you had something you wanted to say.
Who?
Can't hear you.
They miss it.
Nope.
No.
Dang it. I guess not.
You can put it in the chat if you want. We'll read the chat. But yeah, it's a powerful tool, and some of these things that were specialized and researched to impact X, Y, or Z population. It's really quite generalizable training and information that it positively impacts many areas of our lives all the time.
All the time. Mhm.
Great.
Let's see. Well suited to teens.
Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Yep.
Distress tolerance.
Mhm.
That's a good word. Good
It
phrase.
is great. My gosh. And you just realize, right, that's another thing to throw in your vocabulary and keep in your brain is distress tolerance. Is like, how do I help this young person build their distress tolerance? And yelling at them to stop it, you're annoying me is not one of those ways. But
Or
right,
yelling at them to calm down is not the right
but
way.
as frustrated adults, it's easy to be like, just,
Mhm.
and then you're like, oh, this is not helping you build your distress
Right.
tolerance. How do we show up?
I
differently?
used to say to students all the time, we need to get comfortable with discomfort. It's okay to sit with distress without acting on it, right? Without self-harm, without yelling, without punching a wall. It's okay to sit in discomfort. That's what that tolerance piece is about, is I can feel it. It's going to go away. I don't have to act on it. Feelings are they're like a wave. They go out and they come in, right? So yeah, I love DBT. I'm all in for talking about that.
Great.
Yes, not to respond versus react.
Yep.
That's what I love about mindfulness. Yep.
I could use some of that. I think everyone could.
We all could.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. This is another great lunch and learn. We really do have some wonderful ones. If Mary, do you have the new YouTube channel link that maybe you could put in the in the chat for everyone. We record all of these
Mhm.
and we place them on the YouTube channel, the NAMI YouTube channel, and you can go back and see all the lunch and learns that we've done over the past almost a year now.
Yeah.
So,
So I'll send everybody an email with the link
Awesome.
to our new YouTube channel. So
Great.
yeah, I have everybody's email, so that works.
great. And you'll get this one up in a few days, I guess. It always
Hopefully.
takes a while.
Yep, yep. There shouldn't be too much to edit.
Perfect. Well,
Awesome.
thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much for having
Yes,
us. It's the
thank
best part of
you.
our job.
Bye,
everybody.
Bye-bye.